KTAL News Now, live with Brittany Dufresne. KTAL News Now, live with Brittany Dufresne.
All right. Well, sorry about that if you guys haven't been able to hear our sound here. Again, we are covering the Capitol murder trial involving Taylor Parker taking place in Bowie County. I'm joined here by Carolyn Roy, our digital content executive producer, and also courtroom reporter. She's been there all week and since the trial started. So we're going to go ahead and jump in, breaking down the details of, how we've gotten to today and this week's most shocking moment. Hey, Carolyn, how are you doing today?
Good, thanks, Brittany.
Alrighty, so there's a lot of technical things here going on, so if anything, send us a message, but we do want to hear from you. We want to make sure that your questions are answered, so go ahead and send us a comment. We are looking at that and monitoring that, but we're going to go ahead and jump in. So last week we finished off with ending the week. Everyone was sent off for a long weekend, starting on Thursday. Friday seems like everyone's day off to relax and recoup. So let's start with where we picked up. On Monday, coming back to the courtroom, how are things looking?
Well, first of all, that's one of the reasons there are 3-day weekends, because the judge in this trial, I think as I mentioned before, wants to make sure that both the state, the prosecution, and the defense team have the opportunity to prepare for each of the coming weeks in this trial, which is expected to last at least through the end of the month and likely till even well into October, at least as when it gets to the penalty phase, if Taylor Parker is found guilty. So this week we really got into testimony from witnesses who were at the scenes, both on Austin Street at Reagan Hancock's house and also on US 82 in DeKalb, where Taylor Parker was pulled over on the morning of the murders. So we're looking at a lot of evidence this week that either places Taylor Parker at or near the crime scene, or it's evidence that is particular to whether Taylor Parker actually did give birth, which is something that obviously investigators were trying to figure out that morning once they made the connection between Taylor Parker and, again, the crime scene and horrific killing of Reagan Hancock. So just a lot of more crime scene focused testimony, particularly on Thursday. That's when we saw the crime scene photos and heard from the investigators on the scene. But even earlier in the week, we're talking about the interactions between the paramedics and Taylor, and also some of the things that Taylor was allegedly up to in the day or so and hours of that early morning.
I think, like you mentioned, that there was a more evidence-based testimony, but besides that, it was also a bit more emotional on some people who took this stand. Can you tell me a little bit about when Reagan Hancock's mother took the stand, some of the things she mentioned, and maybe also describe in detail for those of us who haven't been able to be there, but you have that front row seat to describe to us, that courtroom environment and the energy when all those details were being spoken about.
There was a lot of difficult emotional testimony this week too. We heard from, on Thursday, we heard from Jessica Brooks, Reagan's mother, who described the loving, close relationship that she had with her daughter. They talked every day, they texted every day. On this particular day, it was a little unusual that she didn't hear from her daughter that morning, she said on the stand. And then she walked the jury through the sequence of events from when she got a phone call from her son-in-law, Reagan's husband, Homer, saying that he couldn't get a hold of her. Earlier this week, we also heard from Homer, and that too was very, very emotional testimony for him. He broke down on the stand several times, just remembering those probably just like a nightmare, horrific moments that he had to relive this week in order for the state to put on a case. So Homer, Jessica Brooks, Reagan's mother, we heard from Marcus Brooks, Reagan's stepfather, since she was 9. And so that's some of the more heartbreaking testimony that we heard. And like I'd say in the courtroom, the judge did warn the people in the gallery, the onlookers, and it's mostly filled with family members, friends of Reagan, and there's some onlookers in there, and of course some media. But the courtroom has been full and just getting more full every day. It seats normally around, I want to say there are 43 to 45 regular seats in there, but they've had to bring in extra seats, and I would say there were close to 70 people packed in there on Thursday. So it's full. It can get stuffy in there with all those people. It's not a big courtroom. But again, the judges warned people to not do anything to distract the jury from what is their job, which is to focus on the evidence and the witness testimony that's being presented to them. So, they don't want anybody having an outburst when we're, or breaking down crying, because it is difficult testimony to listen to and very difficult evidence to look at, particularly the crime scene photos. And at times you could hear sniffling in the courtroom, but because the judge warned people who maybe thought they might not be able to contain themselves, should go ahead and leave before those particular pieces of evidence were put up. So we did see that the jury, we were sort of trying to watch the jury and their reactions. It's something you do in a trial like this or in any trial. And during the crime scene photo portion of the evidence and testimony, we could see that some certainly looked shocked. There was, one put their hand over their mouth as they were looking at these very bloody scenes inside the house on Austin Street where Reagan's body was found. We tried to, we're sitting behind the rail in the courtroom, and the defense and the state teams are in separate tables, obviously. So we can only see the back of her head. But at times, you could see that she had her head down or her head in her hand. You don't see many expressions on her face when you can see her face. It's almost expressionless sometimes. She doesn't look upset. She doesn't look, it's not like she's smiling typically. So it's hard to read. I would say if I had to sum it up, she's hard to read, except that there's not a lot of expression going on her face most of the time.
And so as we continue looking into the week and what happened throughout the week, I think after Monday took a little bit of a recess, right? So it seemed like one of the jurors got a little ill, but then returning Tuesday, it was just, right back to work. Is that what happened?
Yeah. So it was back to testimony first thing Tuesday morning after that juror fell ill on Monday afternoon. And I believe that happened. There's been a lot of testimony. We heard from a lot of witnesses. It happened during testimony around 2 o'clock in the afternoon, and that testimony resumed the next morning. So with that juror, who, like I think I've mentioned last week, there are a few older people on the jury. Doesn't necessarily mean whatever was wrong with that juror had anything to do with their age, but there are older people, and the judge has made a point to say, we're going to try to take a pace that's doesn't tire people out, including the jury. They're looking at a lot of evidence. They have a lot. These are long days, even though it's a 4-day week.
I think I recall reading that so far there's been, and correct me if I'm wrong, almost 50 people who have testified. Yes, who've witnessed.
50 as of the end of testimony yesterday afternoon. There had been 50 witnesses that took the stand, and well over 200 pieces of evidence presented entered into evidence, and that's a nano drop in the bucket compared to all of the evidence that has been gathered this trial has been. The investigators have put together the collected the evidence that's being presented. Reams of digital, if you were to print it out, digital forensic evidence, social media interactions, posts, comments, messages. Then you've got phone records, text messages, Instagram, Snapchat, Google search records, GPS location records. So there's a lot of evidence to go over, and we've probably only seen a fraction of what was actually collected. But the jurors would have are seeing the things that the prosecution feels will help make their case.
Yeah, I know there's been a lot of evidence shown, and this is a really good question that we have here from the people watching. Do we know if the baby was alive at any point? And I really like that question because I do recall reading this through Carolyn's amazing articles that she's been writing up in detail, that, the EMTs at one point, they had a little bit of hope and they lost that hope. Can you tell us a bit more about that testimony that you heard?
We heard testimony that was yesterday with a paramedic that was in the ambulance with baby Braxlin. He didn't know that he thought her name was Clancy because that's what Taylor Parker told him that she'd named him. But he was in the ambulance with baby Braxlin on the way to the hospital. So he testified about the efforts that they made to try to get her breathing again and to get her heart beating again. When paramedics arrived on the scene, Braxlin was not breathing. Her heart was not beating. She was ashen. She was described as gray, lifeless. So they did epinephrine, which is basically adrenaline, and it helps contract the heart muscle and helps it start beating again, or at least that's the hope. So they gave her epi. They continued to do CPR. He testified that they put a bag mask on her and did her breathing for her. And all those efforts paid off, at least briefly. He testified that they did get a heartbeat on the way to the hospital. He testified that they were on cloud nine. That was the phrase that he used, that they might have been able to save this little girl, this baby's life. Unfortunately, they weren't able to get her breathing again on her own, and she was pronounced dead early that afternoon. So, but that's an interesting question as to whether the baby was ever alive or because that's one of the questions that the defense tried to get to in the cross-examination with that paramedic. It appears that they're trying to suggest that maybe the baby was stillborn. So after the defense got up and asked that question on cross-examination, the prosecution, the first assistant district attorney, got back up and just asked the paramedic again, for clarification. If a baby is stillborn, it's born without, it does not have a heartbeat, and therefore there's no heartbeat to get back. So if the baby did have a heartbeat at some point after the paramedics got there and worked on her, then it negates the suggestion that the baby was stillborn. So that's what we understand from the testimony that we've heard so far.
And then so also we have a few people asking this as well. You mentioned that Taylor is a little bit hard to read, Taylor Parker is a little hard to read. People are curious if she has any support in the courtroom. Is there anyone standing by her side, parents, anything like that?
Not that, first of all, there are several close family members are on the witness list, so witnesses aren't allowed to be in the courtroom and to hear testimony and evidence as it's presented before they testify. So her mother, that includes her mother, her father, so her parents are not in the courtroom, and there don't appear to be many people there in support of her, except for her defense team and the Capital Project attorneys who are there, because this is a death penalty case. So if there are supporters in the courtroom, they're keeping to themselves, and it's not obvious. There have been a few people that I've wondered if they are, but it's difficult to know, but it doesn't appear. If there are, they're keeping to themselves, and there's not very many of them. It's a lot of Reagan's family and friends, and a few people who just knew her, and want to be there, maybe to support the family, maybe to hear exactly what's going on, what happened. There's a lot of curiosity. So
now I want to look into a piece of evidence that you've also shared throughout the week is those phone calls from those 911 phone calls and those pieces of evidence that the investigators at the crime scene were able to start piecing together that, okay, wait, are these two incidents related? Can you tell us more about, those testimonies there?
Necessarily the 911 calls themselves that started helping the connection get made, but it is interesting to note that on the morning of the murders, there were two 911 calls, one from Taylor Parker, that was the first one, and that was a call that she made as she was being pulled over in DeKalb. The trooper was pulling up behind her, and she got on the phone and called 911. So jurors heard that call in court this week, and then they also heard the call from Jessica Brooks when she discovered her daughter's body face down in a pool of blood in her living room. That did set off, obviously, a chain of events where paramedics from both scenes were hearing the traffic on their radios about the calls to each of the incidents. You had a call for a baby on the side of the road that had supposedly just been born and was in cardiac arrest. And then they heard the calls, if they weren't at either of these scenes, they heard the calls of the Austin Street crime scene, and a crime scene like nothing New Boston has seen before. So word spreads. And the fact that these two incidents happened within such a short time period, obviously once, Reagan's body was discovered, which was less than an hour after Taylor Parker was pulled over, people were starting to put things together. So the testimony we heard yesterday came from some of those paramedics, the investigator that was on the scene at Reagan's house, and how they had to figure out first how pregnant was she, the investigator that was called to that scene. It obviously was not survivable, the injuries that she suffered. They knew that the minute they got there. But when he found out that she was pregnant, he kind of tried to crouch down, he said, without disturbing the crime scene, and kind of just see, because she, again, face down, so he couldn't see her belly. Try to kind of tell, see if he could tell whether there was a bump there, a baby. It's not that they knew that the baby had been taken at that point. That's kind of the point. They didn't know immediately. So he went back outside and said, how pregnant is she? And they told him that she was in her third trimester. And when he had crouched down, the belly would be much more round, harder. What he saw was a flat belly, concave almost. And he saw a deep enough cut that he could see layers of fat. So he didn't have a good feeling about what they were going to find, but he did go ahead and call EMS back to the scene. The first unit came, didn't even go in because they knew she was dead, and they didn't want to destroy evidence. But once he thought maybe there was a baby still in there and that maybe that baby was still viable, they called another crew back. That crew did go in. They tried to be really careful not to, interfere with any evidence, and they rolled her over, and she was cut open across the belly. There was no baby. So then the investigator on the scene went ahead and put out the call for alerts to be sent to all the hospitals, all the women's clinics, within a 100-mile radius. But already there were phone calls being made to the New Boston Police Department, including some from paramedics who were putting it together, that there was a woman that was now at the hospital with a baby and something didn't seem right. And so that's when the doctors went and examined her and determined that she had not given birth. So that's kind of how that went down, roughly.
And then so we have another question here. Has Wade made an appearance in court to testify against her?
Well, not yet. He is on the witness list. I think that is one of the most anticipated testimonies for me personally, and for anybody who's been following the case, wanting to know, what does Wade have to say about this now? Because we've heard so much testimony. The first week of the trial was really about setting up who is Taylor, what was she up to, what were her motivations, and of course prosecutors have said it was to try to keep Wade from leaving her. And so we really got a picture of Wade as being someone who wasn't as into Taylor as Taylor was into him. He even told his mother at one point when she said, "Do you love her?" And he said, "I care about her, but I don't love her." And she said, "Well, get him gone." But he was concerned because she didn't have any place to go. So he cared about her, he did. But he really did. Every time he brought doubts to her or when someone questioned it, he would go to her and she would give him another crazy story. A lot of us want to hear from him how he feels about how played he was, how much he got played. Because it seems like he's a good, kind of a good old boy. He loved hunting, fishing, loved his, he was good at buying cattle, his mother said. He was really into that. This whole intrigue of her mother supposedly putting a hit out on her, I want to know what he thought of all that. Did he really believe all of that? At one point he told his mother that there were surveillance cameras in the trees in his backyard because Taylor had created a shadow account to make it look like it was coming from her mother's alter ego, saying that she was watching them at all times. She knew they had coffee on the porch that morning, and he believed it. I'm dying to hear from Wade. Yeah, I think a lot of people are. I think the jury must be anxious to know. Even the defense has suggested, and I think it's just part of their strategy. I don't know that they really think they're going to get her acquitted on this, but did Wade know what she was doing? Did he have some idea? Should he have some idea? So we all want the answers to those questions.
Yeah, thank you guys for sending your questions in. That was definitely a good one right there, especially because we have heard from Wade's mother this past week. And so as Carolyn just described, she was able to learn a little bit more about him through her eyes. And so a lot of people are, waiting to hear from him directly. As she mentioned, does he feel fooled by Taylor Parker? So thank you guys for sending your questions in, and please let them keep coming as we are looking to answer all your questions here. I think maybe if we can go into a little bit closer to the end of the week and what the rest of the trial looked like closer to the end of the week. Could you give us a little description at how we ended this week?
Actually, that the testimony from the paramedics who went to the hospital with Parker and Wade in separate ambulances, that was yesterday as well. The paramedic that was in the ambulance with Braxlin described how he does not believe or didn't believe that she had the baby, or there were red flags. The amniotic fluid on the baby was dried and flaky. The baby had been cleaned off. There was the condition of the umbilical cord, which, as everyone has heard by now, was still attached to the baby and tucked into her yoga pants when the trooper pulled her over. But the condition of the cord, I think he said, had degraded, meaning, this is it's human tissue, it's biodegradable, it's filled with blood. When the baby is born, it has to be clamped off and cut, but it hadn't been. It just was hanging off the baby. But the condition of that umbilical cord was a clue. There were just several clues that made him believe, she wasn't a mess. The seat of the car wasn't a mess. She was telling everyone that she'd been in the Walmart in New Boston and kind of felt some pressure, so she went and got in her car and started driving, and then supposedly felt the need to push and pushed. So supposedly, as she was telling everyone, that the baby just came out while she was driving. If that had happened, there's amniotic fluid, there's blood, and other things that happen when you have a baby that would have been evident all over that driver's seat, and he didn't see that. So we heard about that. We also heard from the paramedic who rode in the ambulance with Taylor to the hospital, and how he felt, as he put it, like an idiot, because in retrospect, after he found out what happened, because he was trying to comfort her. He really felt for her. It came out during his testimony that he empathized with her in particular, because it's a traumatic thing to have a baby on the side of the road. and then to not know whether that baby is going to survive. The baby didn't have a heartbeat, and he thought she'd had that baby, so her being distraught was not weird to him, and he felt for her. He held her hand. He revealed on the stand that he had lost a child, so he particularly felt for her. So to find out after all that she was playing him as much as everyone else, he didn't appreciate, for sure. And he also talked about how she didn't appear to still be bleeding. Because the main concern after having a baby, especially under circumstances like that, would be hemorrhaging. So he's watching for signs of bleeding. There was absolutely no blood on her legs. Now, they did cut her pants off in the car and change her into a pair of pajamas, the first of two sort of good Samaritans that arrived on the scene. But put a pin in that, by the way. There's something interesting about that. We'll have to come back to it. But there was just no sign of hemorrhaging. So that was really interesting. And then other testimony we heard on Thursday as the trial wrapped up was from the nurses who were in the ER and who were charged with examining Taylor Parker, to see if because you have to, I guess, after you have had a child after childbirth, they're feeling around for the fundus, which is basically the uterus, to make sure it's pushed back down. They could not find one to push down. Well, that's because she had her uterus removed in 2015. So they were having trouble finding it. There was a lot of kind of lumpiness, which they testified as, now that they, she'd had all kinds of ectomies, things removed, surgeries, and could cause scar tissue. So they thought maybe they were feeling scar tissue. So they had to go and get another nurse to kind of try to, I think they said there were 5 nurses laid their hands on Taylor Parker in the hospital, in the ER, trying to examine her and make sure she was okay after having this child roadside, and just couldn't find any evidence that she actually had. She didn't have any HCG in her urine, which is a hormone that's present in pregnancy, all kinds of signs. And then, of course, the doctor came in and did a vaginal exam and determined she did not give birth. So, interesting stuff there. Very, in a way, not surprising. We know Taylor's baby was taken, or Reagan's baby was taken. Taylor turned up with a baby. But this trial really is about laying out that evidence, because everyone has the right to a trial, and that's what we're doing now.
Yeah, and for this trial, it's not to, and correct me if I'm wrong, not to find her guilty, but if it's a life or death situation. Is that right?
It's really coming down to, certainly for the defense, it appears that what their biggest argument and the focus and purpose of their strategy is going to be on convincing the jury of the specific questions that are laid out in capital punishment laws in Texas. They have to answer, if she is found guilty, 2 questions, and then if they say yes to those 2 questions, they move on to a 3rd question. This happens in the punishment phase of the trial. The first question is whether I'm trying to remember. I know the second of the 2 is, did it happen, if it happened in the commission of a felony? No, y'all are off the track. Hold on.
Oh, good. Okay.
A threat to this community, right? And a danger to others. Well, they continue to be. The second one is, did they kill the person? Did they mean to kill the person? Did they mean to kill the person but fail? Or did they know that the person might die and anticipate it? So if it's, what was the first one again? Those 2 questions are yes. They move on to a 3rd question, and that's mitigation. Really, that's what this trial is going to come down to. If the defense can convince the jury that Taylor Parker had diminished capacity or some other reason to have done this that literally mitigates the punishment she should receive. Typically, that's diminished capacity. There's also sort of moral culpability. It's hard to see how that would apply in this case. That's where if somebody kills somebody else, but it was to save another life. It's that trolley question. If you had to switch the tracks to kill 1 person to save 7, that would be sort of an example of, yes, you killed someone, but there was a reason, right? I don't think the defense is going to go for that one, but maybe the diminished capacity. So, and throughout this trial, even in the guilt and innocence phase, there have been little sort of tussles between the state and the defense, because the state feels the defense is trying to kind of slip some of that mitigation testimony in or evidence in before we even get to that phase of the trial. So I hope that made sense, and I am not a lawyer, but
Well, we know that you are doing a great job, Carolyn, so thank you so much. You've really been giving us the latest details and making sure that the people who the story really has captivated so many, and you've really been able to give us an inside look of that courtroom. I see some questions here of some things that Carolyn has already answered, so I'm just going to reiterate what she's shared with us so far. Questioning, does Taylor Parker look or is expressing any remorse or emotions? Carolyn did say that she's kind of hard to read, so it's unable to tell, see her with any emotions. I mean, in the video we've shown here as well, you can see a few times she's wiping her tears and things like that. And then another question here we see, will Parker's mother be brought to the witness stand? As Carolyn has shared, she is on the witness list. Is that correct?
yes.
Yeah, so we'll be hearing from her sometime soon. We don't know when.
Okay.
Yes,
So,
go ahead.
Let me say this. There are more than 300 witnesses that the state has told the court it could bring. It doesn't mean all 300 are going to end up on the stand. I would think of those, though, you're going to probably hear from one of the major players in the imaginary sort of world that Taylor created. So I'm assuming, but it's not a guarantee. They are on the list, though. Yeah.
Okay. Thank you for that. No, for just giving us a little more inside look of how that can play out there. And then to think that there's 300 people on that list, that's a lot of
expert witnesses. Yeah.
That's a lot of people involved. And so as we hear that number then there, what is the expectation on what's to come as we look ahead?
Well, we believe the state is probably going to wrap up its case next week, over 4 days starting Monday. After that, it would be up to the defense team to take and put on their case. They'll call witnesses, and they'll present their own evidence. We already know because earlier this week they tried to introduce into evidence a letter written from Taylor to Wade's father, her boyfriend's father, a 2-page letter that Wade wrote to him after her arrest. The state objected strenuously. It almost halted the trial so that a hearing could be held on it, because what the state was arguing was that went to what I was talking about earlier, the mitigation phase of the trial. They seem to think that whatever is contained in that letter goes more to maybe Parker's state of mind or motivation, something maybe that the defense wants the jury to know about so that they can decide, oh, there's more to this. We don't know what's in the letter. It wasn't allowed into evidence. But the point is that kind of evidence will go on, and I know that's going to be presented, and that's obviously going to be one of those pieces. So after that, and I don't know how long this defense team's going to take to do their side of the testimony and presenting their case. But they take a week or two. We're already well into, we're into the beginning of October. So I think it's expected that the penalty phase of the trial is probably not going to get underway until October 12th, so mid-October. So the timeline is flexible depending on how the pace of testimony goes or any other issues. Like we've had a juror fall ill, and we only had a half day of testimony. So things like that can affect how long everything's going to take. So take that with a grain of salt.
No, thank you. And Carolyn will be there continuing to be at the trial every single day to ensure that we have the latest information. We will continue to provide you guys with the down to the minute details of what's going on and the evidence that's being provided. I think just to ask you one more question before we kind of close this is there anything that you felt that was important to share with the people that have been so captivated by this story? Anything that you coming into today wanted to share with everyone?
There is a lot. The stories that I've been doing are very detailed, and there's still more I could do every day. I feel like, So it's hard to pick any one thing. There certainly are little details, little moments in this trial that I found surprising that haven't made it into the stories. I might just do a whole story just on that. Little things you might have missed, or little details. I would say one tiny little tidbit is that Reagan's cell phone was never found. Don't know what that means. Maybe the state knows and is gonna. I don't know. Because it was a witness that said the cell phone was never found. You'd think they would have said if it had been. So where is her cell phone? And Parker was found with two phones, a flip phone and her smartphone. The witness testimony didn't indicate whether one of those might be Reagan's, but you would think that they would have said they were. So I don't think so, but it is interesting that she probably had a burner phone. Not surprising, but interesting. So just tiny little details like that. I think the hog story, the bogus hog deal that Taylor set up to get Wade out of town on the morning of the murder is just a whole side trip, literally and figuratively. The fact that this was in our story, I want to say from Wednesday, where we talked to a ranch owner in Wynwood, Oklahoma, that described how Taylor cold called him one day in mid to late September, wanting to sell him some hogs. There was a lot of back and forth texting where they were negotiating, and he was asking her about, if you're coming from Texas, because she said Texas, I can't take hogs from you can't transport livestock across state lines from Texas, and even if you're bringing me hogs from a facility in Oklahoma, you need a license. And she didn't seem to know how to get one, or she was saying that it was X amount of money and an extra fee, and none of that was correct, and he knew that. The ranch he runs, he buys hogs for his clients to hunt. So he buys hogs a lot. He knows about those livestock laws and the license requirements. So anyway, long story short, he's starting to get red flags. He shuts it down and tells her, you know what, I don't think you're telling the truth. Good luck. 5 days later, she texts him back and says, I just saw this. I figured out the license. Can we still do this? And he, no, he didn't want to do the deal. He was not doing the deal. So that was, if it was 5 days later, it would have been September 27th. On October 9th, Wade shows up at the ranch at 7:30 a.m. or something like that, very early, with a gooseneck trailer loaded with hogs. He thinks there's a deal. Taylor has told him, show up, there's going to be a check written out to you for $6,100 for the hogs. There's confusion. This ranch owner is annoyed, didn't know this guy was coming, doesn't know who he is. He pulled up in front of the lodge where he had clients, so he was mad. Tells the ranch manager to tell him to go move up out of the way off the hill. Goes out and meets him. Says what are you doing? Who are you? And Wade says, I got an order for you. Shows him the text that Wade thinks is a conversation, or a text, but text conversation between Taylor and this ranch owner. But it's not, he didn't write that text. It's an Oklahoma number. The ranch owner's number is a Dallas area code because he never changed it when he moved. He's like, that's not me. But it says, hey Wade, this is Scott, I think his name is. Looking forward to seeing you, Friday, because it was a Friday, 7:30 a.m. I'll send you the address for the ranch for GPS, so you can, plug it into your map. I've got a check name written out in your name. So you can imagine that moment with this very annoyed ranch manager and a clueless Wade thinking he's talking to a guy that agreed to it was a $6,100 deal. So that, to me, was one of the craziest, not the craziest, there's been crazier things, but the fact that what did she think would happen, So what did happen, by the way, with the rest of that deal is on our website in that story from, I believe it was day 7 of the trial. So.
information that we can provide for you guys. So we're going to go ahead and close this here. Thank you guys so much for tuning in, giving us your questions. We want to continue providing you with the latest information. So if you feel free, if you're watching this afterwards and you have some questions, go ahead and put it in the comment box. We will definitely get to it at a later time. But again, thank you for tuning in. Carolyn, is there any last words you'd like to mention or say?
That is, I think I've talked a lot. So, but again, I'm happy to answer any questions if you want to share them in the comments, even after this is over. So, yeah, and I am working on a story that's detailing more about the crime scene and what they found. That's hopefully going to be posted here in a little bit this afternoon. So you can keep an eye out for that as well.
Also, I do want to apologize for the delay, but we will be back here next Friday with more in-depth coverage of the Taylor Parker trial, what's going on in Bowie County. So stay tuned for that. Thank you guys again. I hope you have a great weekend and stay safe.